Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy, it only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. Previous guests on the show have included David Fitch, Jared Brock, and Kat Armis. You could go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Andrew Whitehead. Andrew is an associate professor of sociology and director of the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at IUPUI. Whitehead is one of the foremost scholars of Christian nationalism in the United States. He is the lead author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, along with Samuel Perry, which won the 2021 Distinguished Book Award from the Society of the Scientific Study of Religion. His new book is American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church, from Brazos Press. In this episode, Andrew and I have a conversation around Christian nationalism. What is it? What is it not? As we deal with the idols of power, of fear, and of violence, we could root out self-interest and the temptation to make it all about one group over the other. Then we could deal with these issues and disciple others to a better way, a way that looks like Jesus, that lifts up the marginalized and helps create flourishing for all people. Here's my conversation with Andrew Whitehead. Andrew, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. Looking forward to it.
So, Andrew, I'd love to, get in and talk to you about Christian nationalism, your new book, American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. As an entry point to this conversation, I think we probably have to define what you mean by Christian nationalism. What is it and what is it not?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and a right place to start. So Christian nationalism, as I describe it in the book and in my other work, as a sociologist, and then this book is, written to Christians as a Christian. So Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that asserts that civic life in the U.S. should be organized according to a very particular expression of conservative Christianity. So in addition to kind of the standard theological or religious beliefs that we associate with Christianity, Christian nationalism brings with it all of these additional cultural assumptions and baggage, really, around how we need to maintain a really strict social hierarchy. So certain people need to be at the top, some in the middle, some at the bottom. Another kind of cultural assumption is a real comfort with authoritarian social control. So like the world's a chaotic place and we need strong rules and rulers through the threat of violence or through violence to enact that order in society. And then another cultural assumption is really strong ethno-racial boundaries. So this is a country where, certain ethnic and racial groups should kind of be assumed to be American, just in who they are, and others have to kind of prove it through various means. And so again, it's not as though there's just one, expression of Christianity. There are many in the U.S., as we know, but this is saying that really one particular type should be at the center and organize all of social life in the U.S. With kind of everybody else coming after.
So it's one particular type that you're talking about, and so then what does it look like? Then how can we be patriots and Christians? Is that possible if you're talking about Christian nationalism?
Yeah, definitely. It's another great question, and one too that I try to explore. Where when we're talking about nationalism, you can think of it in a way, and some political theorists and other folks have defined this way. When we're talking about nationalism, it's this idea that my country or one country is over and above and better than other countries and nations. And so we, as a group, we're better than them. We should be at the top. And it's kind of idolizing, this group, this nation over and above others. And two, with Christian nationalism, I kind of going back to the definition, thinking that this one particular type of Christianity, right, should be ordering and kind of highlighting what this nation should look like, and it's, over and above others. But patriotism, we can see that as like an affinity or care or love for my countrymen and women, the people that are here. And so it isn't this, so you can be a patriot and want good and want the good for those around you, want the good and the benefits of this culture and society to flow to other groups, to everyone, and not have it be where, one particular group has to be on top or this nation has to be better than any other nation or anything like that, but that we can care for one another and do that with the goal of a common flourishing and a common good. And so patriotism, again, is this kind of love and affinity for the people that are with you. It's almost like when we watch the Olympics. Like these are sports I never watch. I have no idea who these people are, but I see, my country's colors on them, and all of a sudden I have this affinity for them. I'm pulling for them. I want them to do well because it feels like, I'm a part of that. I think that is a great expression of patriotism, whereas when we're, waving the flag in order to, defend boundaries and to enact violence on others, or to push other people to the sides, I think then that's more of an expression of nationalism. So yes, we can be patriots, love this country, want the best for those that are with us. And that can include, at times, I think it has to include telling the truth, right? The hard truths, because that's a part of who we are. And if we want to do better, we have to own up to those. So that's how I think through it and try to write through those different questions.
I think that's really helpful for us as we enter into this conversation, so we know where we're coming from and what we're talking about. For some reason, it's a loaded word and it's a loaded phrase in some pockets of Christianity. So I know that people are like, oh, what does this mean? And a lot of times people are closed off to even hearing something if we don't define it at first. How has your story coalesced with Christian nationalism, and why did you say this is something that I really care about? It needs to be brought forth. People need to know the truth about it and how it is harming the church and the gospel message.
Yeah. So this book really does kind of bring together two strands, both my professional work and then my personal, what you could call faith journey. And so I'll kind of start with the professional side, where I'm a social scientist and mostly study large surveys of the American public. And what we try to basically understand is why Americans do what they do, believe what they believe. And I'm always interested in how religion both shapes how Americans see their world, but then too, how American society can shape religion. And so what I found in working with a colleague of mine, Sam Perry, almost a decade ago now, is that when we were trying to predict various attitudes of the American public, we would account for their political party or political beliefs. We would account for how often they attend church or how they read the Bible, how often they pray, those types of things. But then when we measured what we later called the scale of Christian nationalism, and it's really looking at how strongly do they believe Christianity should be privileged in the U.S. and in, the government, should the government declare us a Christian nation, those types of things. We found that even when we accounted for their politics, their religion, or their demographics, whether they believed the U.S. should be a Christian nation was really powerful in telling us what they might believe and why. And so kind of as a social scientist, I really started wanting to pull that thread and understand, well, what all does this do? And so that's where that work began. But then I think, too, it was a part of this personal faith journey where, and I share some of this in the book, where I grew up in northern Indiana, very religious community, was always in church. It's where I was taught to love the Bible and love Jesus, and those things stayed with me. But as I grew older, I started to realize that the taken for grantedness of this idea of the U.S. as a Christian nation, it became less and less taken for granted through various conversations or things that I had learned. and questions I was asking, where now I was wondering, well, how exactly does my Christian faith interact with or intersect with my citizenship as an American? And are there times where they're opposed, where to be a good, quote unquote, American citizen might mean that I have to compromise parts of my faith? And so I think exploring that and beginning that journey, and I think key to that were, reading books by those who were not like me, whether it was women or racial and ethnic minorities. They had a viewpoint, right, and an experience in this country different than mine. And that started to open my eyes. And so as I started to see in my professional work that Christian nationalism was over and over associated with attitudes and beliefs that I was taught were counter to the Christian gospel and loving our neighbor. So Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism, we find, are much more likely to be xenophobic or to oppose and be afraid of refugees and immigrants. They're much more likely to hold more racist beliefs, to oppose interracial marriage. These types of things where I was like, that doesn't look like the gospel that I was taught. But I was taught in a community and churches where a lot of people still embrace Christian nationalism. So that is where those two kind of journeys intersected, and where I thought, these folks taught me to love Jesus, but yet we're embracing an ideology that I think counters what the gospel called us to do. And so that's what really encouraged me to write this book and to try and put that together, to be able to show how these two things should be disentangled if we're really intent on loving God and loving our neighbor.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we walk in that. These are the tenets of who we are as believers: is we love God, we love our neighbor. We need to figure out who our neighbor is. We don't want to be xenophobic. But I have a colleague here in the office, and she told me, she was like, I was looking for X words for my newsletter, and I found that the opposite of xenophobia was xenomaniacs. And she's like, xenomaniacs are people who love people from foreigners and people from other nations. And so she's like, we want to be xenomaniacs.
I've never heard that.
Yeah, I've never heard it either. That was the first time I heard xenomaniac. It's like, oh, that's a positive phrase as we walk in those things. But I think let's walk in a little bit. I think the power thing is really important when we're talking about Christian nationalism, and we're talking about who we are, that we're the ones that we want to be privileged. We want to be powerful. Sometimes it's subconscious, but then it's very overt, and it's very like in your face. I think it's seeped into the culture, the evangelical culture, in a way where it was subconscious for a while, and then through Trump, and then what happened on January 6th, the insurrection, those things, then it became very overt. We see it. It's in our face. We're confronted with it. We go, oh, how did this happen? Like, where did it come from? So what does it look like for us to grapple with wanting power, and how should we embrace power as Jesus did?
Yeah, that's really, really well put. Wonderful question. Yeah, I think power, in the book, I think power is the central idol of Christian nationalism. And so we can define power as the ability to get others to do what you want despite their resistance. And so when we think about that as Christians, or I guess I'll start with how Christian nationalism views power, is really central, right? To be able to engage with the social world in a way that it does privilege the group, whoever the quote unquote us is. Like, we should be able to privilege ourselves. And so in this sense, in the U.S., through the political system that we have here, as long as it returns privileged access to power, embracing Christian nationalism, it was fine with it. But the distinction I think we have to make as Christians is that it doesn't mean that we're supposed to somehow abdicate all interaction with power and to completely remove ourselves from culture or from the civic sphere. There are some Christians that would say that, maybe identify as like a third way, right? That, I don't like to get political. I just follow Jesus. I actually think that's wrong. And I think that's a privileged position to be able to say that. And the reason is if the politics as they're designed right now aren't coming after you, it's easy to say, I don't get involved because your life or your livelihood's not at stake. But for those on the margins, they have to be involved in politics because they're inherently politicized, right? Because the system doesn't work for them. And so for those folks, I think the distinction we have to make and learn from them is that it isn't that we don't interact with power or hold power or whatever. It's self-interested power. So Christian nationalism is obsessed with a type of power that is only self-interested, that only benefits the us. But as Christians, I think we need to interact with civil society and power that is broadening the definition of the us, right, to everyone. So an example of this is the civil rights movement, where when the Civil Rights Voting Act was passed, that is an expression of power, right? It's a coercive act. It makes everybody follow the same rules, but it's to the benefit of all, right? It's saying that everybody has access to the democratic process. It isn't saying that, okay, now only Black Americans can vote, and now white Americans, you lose the vote, right? It's saying, hey, white Americans, you get the vote. Now Black Americans also have equal access. And that is power, I think, rightly applied, where it's, again, to the flourishing and to the common good of everyone. And so that's the way that we need to be thinking through it in our conversations about what we need to do to benefit all folks. Because so often, as I think, you kind of pointed out, is that for Christians with access to power in the past, or Americans, whichever group, is when, access was opened up and other people were able to have access to power. They felt like something was being taken away, right? And so when things were made equal, they felt like it was discrimination because they were used to privilege. But I think as Christians, we need to be really careful about when we try to privilege ourselves and maybe try to take a stance of how can we be alongside all these other groups when we think about power and what power is used for.
Yeah, I think power is a tricky one because, for me as a white male in this society, I know that I'm privileged and I have power.
Right.
But I also have some capacity to bring capacity to other people.
Yeah.
And I could actually use some of this power for good and the flourishing of others. But, when I'm grappling with it myself, at first I'm pretty reticent to get involved because I don't want to, misconstrue the ways that people are being subjugated or marginalized or neglected. It's tricky. And I have had marginalized people say, no, we need your voice and we need you. And it freed me up in a way to say, okay, I can stand with others, learn from the marginalized and listen and then walk alongside of them. And I don't have to try to do it all by myself. And that's a hard thing to do. I mean, I run a mission agency. So one of the things that we want as missionaries is we want to see the gospel in the hands of neglected people. We want to see neglected people lifted up. But that the way that we enter into society is really, it's crucial and it's a difficult thing. We come in as in a privileged position, but oftentimes we want to lift others up. And so we want to come in as equals and friends, and we want to belong into the community that we're serving and we're with, that we're not just servants, but we're just a part of the community. It's a really difficult thing to navigate. And so how then do you think we could start to navigate that as believers? How can we go in and serve alongside marginalized and neglected people in a way that exhibits power properly, in a way that, can be for the glory of God?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I think, the way that you're kind of describing it, I think is so important because all of these decisions are context specific, and we need to find that answer in conversation, right? Especially with those that are on the margins, right? And listening to them, what wisdom they have to give us, what they're telling us they need, not what we think they need. And so I think that conversation and going in humbly at that point, and then too, with our privilege, how we leverage it for folks, I think is key in that we choose to. And I think some of that, part of that is giving up control. So there was a community, Shalom Community Church, and I write about this in the book, where they were reading different books, and this was in the midst of George Floyd and a lot of the reckoning, around racial injustice over the last couple of years. And they were looking at their denomination and the history of racial injustice and the work that was happening in that denomination. And through various events that I share, they come to this desire to give away, to give resources to African-American community. And so they had a person that they were interacting with. They created a little board, and they just collected as much money as they could, and they just gave that money to them to distribute however they wanted. They didn't want any sort of report. They didn't want any sort of case to be made for how it was spent. And other churches were interested in taking part, but then wanted to know, like, well, how will it be spent? All these things. And they're like, well, that's not the point. The point is we are going to take what we have, right, our resources, and we are privileged in our resources, and we're going to give them and give up control. And giving up that control was really formative for that community to really realize that isn't about us to go in somewhere and to know what to do and to do those things to these people that need it, but to take a step back to listen to what this group needs, to then give them what they need and allow them to lead and for us to follow. So, I mean, I like how you're talking about it when you're describing it, where it's come alongside, right? To listen, let them lead. It isn't as though they need us to show the way, but that we need to learn basically from that position what it's like, to follow God and to be faithful. Because as you shared too, as white Protestant guys in the U.S., we've been privileged, right, for centuries. And so now learning, well, what does it mean to be a Christian, a faithful Christian? I think for me, it's listening to those that are kind of on that outside, because I think that's where the Christian faith is found, where God's found is on the margins.
Yeah, I think you're right too. That's where Jesus spent his time. That's what he said he was for in Luke chapter 4 as he announced his ministry.
Right.
One of the other things that you say that Christian nationalism does is has an unhealthy fear, and the way that they yield fear to manipulate people into other things. Fear is hard. I know when I moved back to the United States after being away for a long time in another part of the world, I could feel a spirit of fear. I noticed it everywhere that I went in America. It was night and day from other countries that I was in. And it was really interesting that fear is the thing that drives most of us. How is fear used within Christian nationalism?
Yeah. No, that's such an interesting experience that you had, and really shows, kind of the central aspect of it here. So fear or sense of threat is so powerful as a motivator, right? And so that's why if we just look at even our political climate, fear is constant, because that's what's going to get people to then act. And so fear is, the second idol of Christian nationalism. And really what it flows from is this perceived loss of privileged access to power. And so that's how it relates to this desire for self-interested power, is when we fear that is being taken away, we're more likely then to want to distinguish really strong definitions of who we are, who they are, and knowing who the outgroup is trying to take what we have. And so fear really does build up these dividing walls of hostility. And so as an idol of Christian nationalism, it is telling us that it'll provide safety and security. But what it really does is, I think, causes us to move in the opposite direction of what Jesus called us to do, which is to break down the dividing walls of hostility, to move towards those who might be different. And again, it really does connect to power, where when we're used to privilege, any sort of equality feels like discrimination, where we really have to be careful when it isn't as though we can't have a say. It's that we're upset that we're not the only, group that has a say. When other groups have a say as well, or we're going to try and function in a pluralistic democratic society and compromise, right? All these are a part of it. That can be scary. And it can be hard. But I think it's ultimately worthwhile if we're going to love our neighbors as we would want to be loved. Because we wouldn't want them to just say, no, you don't have a say, so we shouldn't act that way towards them. And Christian nationalism over and over really does kind of, bring in this sense of fear and threat of others rather than encouraging, love and hope and peacemaking among groups.
Yeah, I mean, the New Testament has a lot to say about love and peacemaking among groups, but it also has things to say about fear and persecution, and that we are a marginalized society because it was written in the time and the place where the early Christians were marginalized. They were the neglected in that space. And so if we're reading scripture through our Western lenses, white evangelical Western lenses, we're kind of misreading who it was for and what was the context in which this was written. And so it's really important that I think that we step back a little bit and realize where are we in the story, and what is our position within this framework? Because I think it's really easy to misconstrue those things, and because I want to identify with the early Christians and the people that were around Jesus and with Jesus, because I'm a follower of Jesus. I want to identify that way. How can we do that work of knowing that we have these cultural assumptions that we don't actually reckon with much? And how can we start to analyze those things so that we can recognize where we are and how we could rightly interpret it for our time and day and age?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think too, as you've mentioned earlier too, like folks coming from outside of our context today, evangelical Christians or mainline Christians from other countries, they can quickly see the cultural assumptions that we are blind to, right? They pick them up like right away, and they're like, well, why is this so important for, evangelicals in the U.S.? And for us, we think, well, this is just how evangelical Christianity is, or, how I was raised. And so I think that's so important, is listening to those voices, because you're right. Like if we look at the story and history, the most powerful country in the world usually isn't, right in the center of God's story. And America is and has been. And so we have to really kind of wrestle with that. So yeah, I agree with you 100%.
So how have you learned how to overcome fear in your own personal journey and faith journey?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I want to be kind of precise here too, where when I'm writing about fear, really talking about group level fear, right? This fear of protecting my group. That don't want to talk about, or I'm not talking about anxiety, very real, mental health types of questions, because sometimes the Bible has been used as kind of I think in a really harmful way for people that have anxiety or other things, where it's like, oh, God said don't fear, so just stop. I think that's really unhealthy, just kind of as an aside. So I'm really wanting to say, okay, as we read the Bible and read those commands to not fear, let's think about it, as threat to our group. Let's interpret it that way. And so I think, part of it is reading and listening and maintaining relationships, with those, or at least interacting with those arguments and groups and what they're thinking that we might see as outside of our group. And so growing up, being afraid of Democrats or secularists or feminists or humanists, all these things that were quote unquote threats to the gospel. What I found were these were, more, not always, but it's the same in the church as out, but more often than not, just really lovely people that, want to care for their families and their communities. And there's things that we all agree on. We might have differing beliefs, but, there are values that we all hold. And so that was the start of thinking, well, this doesn't quite make sense to me, why I'm told to fear this other group. And so I think to the extent that folks can interact with and learn from and listen to, and really, just sit and listen to the stories and experiences and just try to empathize with the stories that are being told, and to think, well, what if things were so difficult in a country that I was living in, again, by historical accident. None of us chose to be, born in the U.S. We just happened to be. But I was in a country where it was so bad that I would risk everything to try and take my child somewhere else to maybe they would have a better life. Like, what type of, what would really motivate me to do that? And how bad must it be for me to then just give up everything I've known to go do that? And then when we see these stories, and this is just on my mind because it was relatively recently, where, at the border, there are these buoys being put up with razors in the center of the buoys. So people coming through, it's going to cut them. To wrap my mind around how little empathy we have for folks that are trying to find a better way. And yes, there could be folks that are coming who might be perceived as dangerous, but the vast majority, right, are not. And so to think through, and just the lack of empathy. So I think with fear, a key step to take is to walk this, as I write, this path of empathy, where we're really trying to gain proximity to folks, to listen to them, to their stories, to allow them to take up space and to teach us. I think then we start to see this thread of common humanity, and the fact that there's little to be afraid of and much to learn, even in the midst of what could be, some stretching, some, difficult times where we have to set some things aside. I think that's worthwhile. And so for me, that's been part of my journey, as much as it can be, is just to interact, to listen, and empathize.
So how can we interact and listen and empathize and have conversations within our faith community to say, this is where I see Christian nationalism seeping in, and is Jesus calling us to a better way, a different way? How can we have conversations that are constructive and healthy, and they're not polarized like our political lives, but are really talking, what does it look like to be faithful in our faith community?
Yeah, well, I think one way, as I talk with different folks or pastors who read the book or are interacting with this work, I really think that in some way part of the goal of what we should be about in confronting and opposing Christian nationalism is, a part of that is discipleship. And it's really helping folks think about power, think about fear, think about violence, and Christian responses to it. And again, there's not some magic, like, quote unquote Christianity, this one type out there that we're all trying to get to, but there are various expressions of the Christian faith, right? And differ on little things or some bigger things, but finding those expressions of the Christian faith that allow us, help us understand what power is, how Jesus thought about it, as we look at his life and ministry, and as we look at fear and how Jesus, or, the Gospels think about fear, and discipling folks into, when they hear fear-based messages, one thing I talk about that is helpful sometimes is there empirical support for this idea that, well, if immigrants come, crime is going to go up. Well, we find that in communities with more immigration, crime goes down. And so, trying to think through and to recognize when fear is being activated, or when this desire to protect our power is being activated, to have the resources of, okay, this is what my expression of Christianity teaches about that. So people can start to recognize it. And I think then we start to flip that switch where it isn't just this automatic down this path. And so I think that's a part of it is, and then we don't actually have to talk about Christian nationalism, which can be a phrase that will put up walls, but let's talk about fear and violence and power, and give resources so folks can do that. And so I think, that's one way. And then, the other thing that I want to be really clear on too, is that in our current, political and cultural context, as we look at, we kind of have a two-party system, and there is one that is more intent on rolling back access to the democratic process. And so, it isn't this thing where Christians are always on one side or the other. But right now, if we're going to be about expanding access to democracy, that necessarily places us on one side. And that's the fault of the two parties, or the fault of one party right now. It isn't as though that won't be the case in the future. But I think as Christians, we have to realize, again, that there isn't some like opting out third way type of thing, but that as we come to particular political issues, we recognize where are folks being marginalized, and is this political party telling us, hey, you're marginalized, you need to side with us because you're marginalized? Or as white Christians, generally, can we say, okay, are these actions marginalizing the other, somebody else? And then that's where we need to locate ourselves. And again, that isn't for all time, into the future, but right now, I think it is rather clear. And so that's what we have to be about, is that a friend that I interviewed in the book, she talked about no friendship is apolitical, right? So if we're going to be with people, a lot of times those on the margins are politicized, right? Politics is placing them on one side. And so we have to be with them. And sometimes that'll mean that we have to, side with one group over the other. But again, that changes to context and topic. But I think that's where we need to be looking is who's being marginalized. And if we're being told to fear because we are, I think that should put up a red flag.
I think that's good. Then how can we engage civically and then within our community in a way that promotes flourishing for everyone? And that actually goes like even people, I think, I'll just give, I think one thing that you mentioned, like even the Seven Mountains theology of, we have some people in that really say, I want to control these spheres of society. But some people say, oh, this is a framework in a way where, what are the ways that we could actually bring kingdom flourishing to these different areas? And so like even that's a mixed bag sometimes of what you're going to get. You don't know what you're going to get. You're either going to get something that wants to reckon with power and I want to hold on to power and use fear to control something, and sometimes violence, and some people that want kingdom flourishing. So then how can we interact in the community, engage civically, and then promote kingdom flourishing in a way that brings the marginalized and neglected to an equal footing?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I'm excited about too, and, in giving different examples of folks in the book that are pushing, from different expressions of Christianity that I think are confronting and opposing Christian nationalism, are moving towards a common flourishing, is that there really isn't like a 5-step thing, but that the creativity of Christians in their context, as they see it, as they create proximity with those that are marginalized and listen and learn and follow them and the wisdom that they have, there will be different ways of doing it that spring up that are going to be wonderful examples for us that I can't wait to see and hear about and learn from, and hopefully see replicated elsewhere. And so in that sense, it isn't as though there are particular ways of doing it, but I think that keeping at the center this desire to, question anytime I'm being told to fear that something's being taken away from me and that I'm going to suffer. So as a Christian, is that really true? And then to listen and learn from those that are marginalized, whose voices have been silenced or ignored, and then to learn from them. And sometimes for me, maybe it doesn't always make complete sense, or I haven't experienced it myself, but to trust them, right? That these folks are telling the truth and that I can empathize with that, and then to follow their lead from what they say to do. I think that's when we can really be able to participate in a pluralistic democratic society where we all have very different beliefs, but the values we hold the same are that everybody should be able to participate and have a say, and that there are going to be times where we have to compromise and move forward. And as Christians, just being, flexible in that, right? And what that means. If we have an end that we want to see in common flourishing, how can we move towards that no matter what, instead of just saying our way or the highway type of thing?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think what you're saying and talking about, how do we have conversations in a way that grapple with these issues of fear and violence and power, and what is the Jesus way, and how we could do this differently in a faith community. These are always questions that we need to grapple with. And, this exposing of Christian nationalism has really confronted us in a way which I think is really helpful, that we could look at ourselves and say, oh, what do we truly believe? And is this what Jesus is calling us to, or have we gone off the deep end? Like, how do we get back to what Jesus wants us to do? How do we follow him? I think it's really important. So they're incredible questions. If you have one hope for this book and for people engaging with it, what is the hope that you have?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I try to end on a note of hope. I think my big hope for the book is that it'll find, probably any author would say this, but that it will find its audience, right? That the people that are on this journey, that I hope the book is helpful as being, another link in that chain, another step on their journey, as so many books have been on mine. And that's what I really want to reiterate too, is that we're all on a journey, we're all learning, and reckoning with Christian nationalism, confronting it, opposing it, isn't like an amputation that the American Christian Church just cuts it off and then now we've solved it, we're good. But that it's more like flossing, where we have to do it every day. It's something that we have to commit to, and we have to realize there are going to be good days and bad days, or we're going to misstep here and then try to learn and grow. And so I think it's more of it's more of a journey that we're committing to. We're committing to changing our position and where we're moving. Instead of being carried along or moving in one direction, we want to turn and move in the other. And some days we'll be able to make more headway than others, but I think committing to that journey. And so my hope for my book is, if it helps turn somebody around, or the person that's already been turned around and moving, it helps them further down the line. That would be my hope. And and that I'm going to continue to learn and grow and commit to the journey as well.
Yeah, well, I hope that happens as well. And I hope that people go out and get your book, American Idolatry. It's really good, and it helps us wrestle with these things of power and fear and violence, and where it stems from, and then how we could go from here, and what we can do to move forward in a healthy way. So thank you for this book. It's really, really good, and I highly recommend it. A couple of questions I have, Andrew. If you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh man, that's a curveball here. If I could give myself advice when I was 21, I think this kind of moves beyond the book, but I think for young people, or if I was 21, that there's no, you have time to kind of find and experience things, and you don't have to meet these kind of like checkpoints of life according to any sort of, I don't know. I think for me, when I was 21, I felt like I have to do this by this, and I have to get there, or else I will have failed at life. And that just isn't true. You're gonna, to go and experience and take time and find out who you are and what you're interested in. And again, I guess seeing it as a journey rather than some sort of destination we have to get to. That was key for me, or trying to, grow in that. So I would tell my 21-year-old self to, you're going to find your place, enjoy the journey, maybe take a risk or two, because there's time to recover. You're not going to fail at life, by 28 or 29. So you've got some time. So that is outside what the book is about, but hopefully that works. That's what I would say.
That's really helpful for people. I think that's great. Anything that you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Yeah. So I just finished, I have it right here actually, this book, Holy Unhappiness by Amanda Held Opelt. And it's really interesting because it's talking about, growing up in evangelical Christianity, we saw the prosperity gospel, right? And and saw it as heresy, right? These televangelists and everything. And, God isn't about giving you wealth here on earth, that type of thing. But what she does in this book that I really appreciate is she's highlighting what she calls the emotional prosperity gospel, where within evangelicalism, at least for me growing up, and we're of a similar age, there was this idea that if you follow God closely, that you will feel purpose in your life. You'll have kind of emotional peace or happiness. And she's kind of showing how that emotional prosperity gospel really was a big part of how we saw the world, and showing that you won't always be happy. You won't always have peace. There are going to be times where you feel lost or that God's distant, all of these different things. And that doesn't mean you're not being faithful. And so being faithful to God doesn't mean you'll always be happy. But and that, I think, is something that for me I've had to learn over the years, or having kids. Life doesn't work out, sometimes, or the way that we want. And so trying to reckon with that. Her book, Holy Unhappiness, has been helpful, and I've really enjoyed it.
It's a great recommendation. Andrew, how can people find your book, connect with you? Is there any local bookstore somewhere that you would want to point people to? How could they connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm on various social media, Twitter and Instagram, or as long as some of these are around, and so that people can find me there. And then, bookshop.org is great because you can donate to local bookshops. Baker Bookhouse, they consistently have the book for the cheapest amount and generally free shipping too. So
wow.
I always love to point people there because I just want them to have the book. That's a great place to go. It's obviously available online at the large retail stores and things like that. So wherever it is that you find your books, it'll be there. So
great. Well, go out, get American Idolatry. Andrew, thank you for this conversation. It was great to be able to wrestle with fear and power and violence, and figure out how Christian nationalism has seeped into our culture, and that we need to confront it, do away with it, and move into a different way. And it was really helpful, and a helpful conversation. So hopefully people go out, get your book, and live a better way, in a way that looks more like Jesus. So thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you so much. Always enjoy the conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review, and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes, and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.